But peace is more than that. It's a set of conditions that make decent life possible. The absence of war, but also the presence of justice, the absence of repression, freedom of expression, etc.
Multilateralism is in danger. Across European society, politics, and mainstream media, there is a strange resignation in the face of armed conflicts, a drive to militarize, and a reluctance to invest in diplomacy, peacebuilding, and international cooperation. Pacifist thinking is increasingly dismissed as utopian or naive, while some who do use the language of peace and negotiation do so in blatantly inconsistent, cynical, and unjust ways. Have we forgotten the lessons of the 20th century and the EU's peace project, or did we never really learn them to begin with? What has happened to the civil peace movement? What role can and should the Greens play? And where have all the hippies gone? I'm your host for this episode, Seden Anlar. Welcome to Where Have All the Hippies Gone? A podcast series created by Jeff, the Green European Foundation, to reflect on the place of pacifism in today's Europe and within the Green movement specifically. Peace building, diplomacy, and the protection of people and the planet lie at the core of Green's DNA. But there seem to be significant questions as to what this looks like in practice. So each episode, we speak to a different expert to deepen our understanding of pacifism, green thinking, and how to make sense of our current moment. In this episode, we're joined by Anne Nguyen, a researcher at the Belgian peace and security think tank, GRIP. Her research focuses particularly on security and environmental issues, including conflict-related pollution and its remediation. Anne actually co-authored a report for Jeff called Green Approaches to Security and Defense, where she mapped out Green Party's evolving stances on key defense questions in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Take a listen. Anne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for making time for this. I'm really glad to be having this conversation with you. Who better than with you for us to ask, where have all the hippies gone? But before we get to that key question, maybe we can set the scene a little bit and talk about the context. I already mentioned Putin's invasion of Ukraine. One of the things that followed the invasion and the EU's response to it, and I think many people noticed this, was the lack of diplomatic response or diplomatic channels being utilized or multilateral institutions meaningfully being used. And there would be nothing stopping the violence takeover and the loss, the casualties, everything that war destroys, basically, not only human lives, but also the environment, the heritage, the cultural heritage, displacement. How do you explain it? What's your diagnosis? Why does diplomacy appear absent when we basically need it the most?
Wow. Big question.
No pressure.
Good question. So on the case of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February 2022, there was a general agreement among NATO countries in general that dialogue and diplomacy has been cut by Putin and by the invasion in Ukraine, and that was considered as a breach of diplomacy. But there's not only that. There's also, and that was what we found in the interviews we conducted. My colleague Gatoverde, who is the main author of the study we've conducted for the Green European Foundation, is these experts noticed that there was some kind of a civilizational discourse in the war happening in Ukraine, and it's not just a war between like two countries. It's a civilizational war in which, on one side, there's a perception of like an irrational, uber-nationalist leader against a democracy, and there's a sense of, why should we talk to, quote unquote, the devil? And And in that sense, diplomacy, while you have like all these military means deployed in Ukraine, looked somehow weak, you know? And it's not the case at all. But there was a sense of diplomacy, like speaking and multilateralism was perceived as a weakness. Well, it's actually a political mean like many others, and military means being not the only means that are to be deployed. Diplomacy does not mean by any sense weakness, nor does it mean that we agree with the territorial gains that Moscow has had. It doesn't mean that at all. But in a sense, politics and international politics has become incredibly polarized in the current day. So, which is why I think one of the reasons for me that diplomacy has been less of a desirable solution.
That's very interesting, that diplomacy being viewed as a weakness. I mean, some might argue that in such a context, trying to create a dialogue might even require more strength than just going with the military operations. I guess that wasn't the discourse.
Maybe not, indeed. But if we look at history, it was at the moment where like politics and international politics was the most tense that diplomacy was a solution. If you look at the SALT Accord, like between the United States and the Soviet Union back in 72 for the first SALT Accord, and 79 for the second SALT Accord, it was an agreement on, hey, let's not build more nuclear warheads. It was a moment where both states had the capability to annihilate one another and the whole planet with them several times. That at that time, dialogue helped quell down the tensions. So I think we can and we should be a bit inspired by former earlier diplomatic efforts, and it doesn't mean at all that we agree with like the illegal things that Putin's Russia has done in Ukraine. Not at all.
Absolutely. And while the EU had this kind of response for the invasion of Ukraine, at the same time, when it comes to Israel's total violation of international law in Gaza, the response has been weak and divided. What does this mean for the EU as an influential actor in an increasingly militarized global order, this tension that you mentioned? And also considering that the EU is a peace project, where does this leave its credibility as a peace project?
So the EU has had, as you mentioned, a very differential response to Ukraine and to Gaza. So the EU actually, is divided on the question of Palestine in general. All the countries of the EU do not recognize Palestine as a state to start with. So somehow it's not surprising that the response has been divided, even though Josep Borrell has been quite consistent in condemning the colonization of the West Bank by Israel. And he has been also consistent in condemning Israel's military actions, and which has been labeled, by the way, as war crimes and crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court, and also by an increasing number of organizations, including Amnesty International, Al-Haq, but also Francesca Albanese from the UN as a genocide. And there's the EU's response, which is divided, basically reflects the position that the EU has had toward Palestine way earlier than October 2023. But what is perceived negatively by the EU, from the EU as a peace project, is the inability of the EU to prevent some of its member states to provide weapons to Israel. Let's remember that Germany is the second provider of weapons to Israel. And while other countries such as Spain, such as Belgium, have suspended their weapon sales to Israel, not all EU countries have done that. And this is perceived by the civil society, by organizations, as a failure of the EU. And a second thing that I see is the EU has indeed been an actor for peace and an actor that has promoted peace negotiations. If you look at the Algiers Accords for Mali, if you look at the 6-point plan between Russia and Georgia, or the peace process in Syria in which the EU has played a role, clearly this role hasn't been played in the case of Palestine. And in terms of credibility, the EU's voice has indeed been perceived as lacking strengths, especially in the eyes of the global south.
Absolutely. Something else that we're seeing is, and that's leaving multilateralism inapplicable or harder to apply in the current context, is the very words like diplomacy, human rights, or even peace getting co-opted or misused by different actors like Russia, the US, China, and the EU.
Of course.
Yeah, and as you said, we see a lot of double standards there, inconsistencies and hypocrisy. And I know this has always been the case, but looking at it now, does that mean that these words are just now empty words, empty terms, concepts, and we've lost them? Or can we use the current climate to give them a new force and meaning?
Actually, the language of peace and human rights has always been manipulated. These words have always been twisted somehow, because these are values that are generally desirable. But the thing is, they've also been so flattened out of their political sense when they're endorsed by a large number of persons and large international organizations, since each member state needs to agree with the notion of peace, of human rights, of democracy. So their controversial aspect, their radical nature is flattened down, because peace is political, it's radical. Diplomacy is messy. It requires work. It requires to roll up one's sleeves. It's not a passive action, while military action is viewed as being the active response to a conflict or to a problem. And in the current climate, I think, in my sense, it needs to prompt us to breathe thinking and action and politics inside these concepts again, and to apply them to everybody and not just Westerners. And this is the way you give back some life and meanings to these principles before the far rights either ban them or makes an overlying alternative out of them.
Yeah, that's a great line. But alongside this erosion that you mentioned of these words, values, we also see pacifism has increasingly been branded as utopian or like a naive idea. I think, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, if you say it now, the response is like, "Oh, you're so naive. We need to be realists in this world." But in history, there were obviously very strong pacifist movements. The green movements at large, we can define them as pacifists. But there is the sense that it's not how it used to be. Do you agree with that? And if so, what happened? Have we lost these movements? And is pacifism done for good?
Pacifism has always had several strands. You had like the absolute pacifist and the relative pacifist. For some pacifists, you shouldn't fight, periods. And for some others, like, yeah, but if you're being attacked, then you have the right to self-defense. You've always had these like two strands of pacifism and more strands of pacifism. And by the way, pacifism has always been perceived as a naive utopia. Even when it was at its highest point, people think of the 60s and 70s, but it's always been perceived as a naivety. Let's remember the 100,000 who demonstrated against the war in Vietnam. Let's remember the millions who got out in the streets demonstrating during the 1980s against the Euro missiles, saying we don't want US missiles on European soil. The millions of them. And at that time, pacifism has been repressed. I mean, quite violently, and sometimes lethal force was used. In the US, you've had like the massacre of Kent universities, in which like the National Guard has shot against students protesting against the war in Vietnam, and there's been 4 deaths. If you look at the way protests in universities have been repressed when students were protesting against what is happening in Palestine, you still have this repression. But in that whole context, where's the pacifism in the Greens of today? The Greens, like especially Western European Green parties, have emerged in that whole context of like anti-nuclear protest, and the link between like nuclear power and nuclear weapons and environmental activism was stringent then. And this is what we noticed with my co-author during the study, that there was some kind of a generational shift. For some of the Green MEPs that MPs that we interviewed, they've never joined a pacifist party. They call themselves a peace-loving party. But by the time the younger generation has joined the Green parties, they were either no longer pacifist parties, or if you look at Eastern European Green parties who come from another reality, like geostrategically, they were not pacifist parties to start with. So there's the generational aspect, but also some of the Green parties, not all in Europe, they've been in governmental coalitions in which they had to govern over security and defense issue way earlier than now. If you look at the German Greens, they were in power during the ex-Yugoslavian war. So they had to do concessions, to make concessions as part of their exercise of governance in a coalition. And yeah, indeed, now with the war in Ukraine, pacifism is not cool, you know. But if you look at peace and pacifism, peace is not just perceived as the absence of war. In that sense, peace is easy. If it's just the absence of war, you just put your weapon down and voila. But peace is more than that. And in the sense of Johan Galtung, the scholar, positive peace, as opposed to negative peace, like the absence of war, is more than that. It's a set of conditions that make decent life possible. The absence of war, but also the presence of justice, the absence of repression, freedom of expression, etc. And the idea that pacifism is somehow not cool and even more, like, as you mentioned, a bad word, you already feel the consequences of it. So you have important think tanks that have been critical of militarism or that have pushed toward like more of a human security point of view. They have suffered the brunt of conservative governments' crackdown. CIPRI, for instance, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which is a well-recognized research center on security, has lost its governmental fund in a time where it's more than ever crucial to think about mediation, negotiations, and non-military solutions.
So pacifism and principles like no destruction, no violence, indeed were central to green movements for decades. But in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there seems to have been a shift within the Greens in Europe. You've looked into the Greens' approaches to security and defense for the joint report by Jeff and Grip called Green Approaches to Security and Defense. What were your findings? Where do the Greens stand at the moment?
We did interviews with members of parliament, members of European parliaments, but also experts on security and peace. What was surprising after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is the way and the speed that some Green parties have aligned in terms of peace and security with the more mainstream point of view on defense and security. It's not just about helping Ukraine, that's a no-brainer, but it's the way they've shifted from we are going to be critical toward like that threshold of 2% of the GDP of a country in defense in the expenditures, from being critical of that to say, no, we're no longer questioning that. It's very much that reactive approach has been surprising, especially for certain experts of security and defense, and even experts that come from a more like conventional security point of view. We've had people who self-identify as neorealists and people who self-identify as very much in favor of a solid defense, thinking, hey, Greens, what the hell? And not in the sense that it's surprising, but in the sense that in a democracy, the Green parties was somehow expected, and the role of the Green Party was to also bring this alternative thinking on security and defense, even though they haven't, before the war in Ukraine, haven't seized themselves of the topic of security and defense. But the role of the Green as like proposing an alternative was still underlined even by party members who were not siding necessarily with the Green on security and defense.
Okay, that's where the Greens stand. And since the Greens' stance on this issue has been shifting and evolving, could they still play a role that they always play in other discourses and bring an alternative vision of security that could focus on all the threats we're facing, including the environmental, social, and the threats on human rights?
I think that's a dialogue that the Greens need to have with their polities and among different Green parties and different like shades of Greens and different. How do you want to like implement that? This is very much like work in progress, and that's exciting actually. I think in order to like balance all of these elements, I mean, there's no secrets. You fund education, you fund health, you fund environmental preservation, ecological transition, human right protection. Ecology is not necessarily costly. Individualism is. And saving the environment without saving societies within this environment, well, societies that are part of this environment, it's nonsensical. It's the easier thing if you want to save the planet. It's like, okay, humans disappear. But no, that doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. And it actually all goes together. Like solving the ecological crisis is tied to making societies more sustainable. In order to make them more sustainable, you need them to be fairer. It also is tied to making conflicts less likely. But how do we do it? It's a dialogue and it's a work currently in progress. It's a work like where we have to tackle the topics that make people angry. Pacifism being one, justice being one. The way we consume and the way we live in this planet being one. So it's definitely controversial. And on the issue of human security and seeing the climate catastrophe in front of us as a threat, the climate crisis is a dangerous situation. It's an urgent one, and people want to feel safe, and that's perfectly normal. It's a normal setting to build up your life. And it needs a resolution because people are actually already dying of like climate disasters, and there's already climate refugees. But I'd be careful about making an urgent situation necessarily a security problem. Why? Because in the name of security, you have a lot of things that are done, and all the elements that safeguard democracy, that safeguards like individual freedoms, like human rights and things like that, sometimes they are pushed aside. Look at what we are doing in the name of anti-terrorism. And this is something that we should be wary about. And in that sense, I think there's a need for more like justice, more representation, and more equity in that dealing with the climate crisis, but also security issues.
Let's look ahead a bit as well. There are now new developments that are adding to all the context that you explained, one of which, an important one, being the Trump presidency in the US. As you know, he has exited the Paris Agreement again and pulled out from World Health Organization too.
Yep.
And he's also threatening to sever ties with NATO.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things are obviously posing a greater existential threat to multilateralism. What do you foresee happening now at the international level?
I can't foresee anything. I'm unfortunately not a clairvoyant. I wish I was. Would make things a lot less complicated. But no, I can't really foresee things. But what Trump has shown by withdrawing of the Paris agreements, of WHO, is that he's able and he's going to be willing to withdraw from NATO. It's not a bluff.
Yeah.
He's done that. He can do it. It's the position that I can see. And for that, we've had people among green European politics who said that's why we need to reinforce like European defense. And is that the panacea? I don't know. I certainly don't know. But if you look at the military capabilities of the EU, if big condition, if they manage to integrate the security and defense issue, the EU will be, in terms of personnel and in terms of material capabilities, the third military power in the world after the US and China. So this is one of the elements that is here in the table right now. Will the EU be able to integrate in terms of security and defense? I'm not sure. I don't know. On the question of multilateralism, what does it say about multilateralism? Is that in a certain group of far-right populists, multilateralism doesn't really convince anymore. And they play on that, but also more generally in the global population, is there enough information on multilateralism, or has these large organizations become just like even larger bureaucracies who make laws that regulate people's lives? And multilateralism means many things. It can mean the Paris Accords. It can mean like a collective effort to solve the world's major problems, including the climate crisis at hand. But it also can mean like global deregulation of economic regulations and environmental measures. For a lot of people, this is very much about deregulation. And the role of civil society is crucial. Why? Because civil society has the potential to empower citizens to act, but also to pressure the governments to implement climate policies. But civil society also needs to be vigilant on how and what policies are being enforced, what measures are really being implemented to preserve the planet. And if it takes to be disruptive toward a multilateral process that destroys the planet and its citizens, then this too is the role of civil society.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the repression that we see against civil society. In a climate like this, how can grassroots peace movements stand their ground and stay influential?
Organize. I mean, one of the reproaches which is now done to civil society movements is a lot of it is based on advocacy. You advocate, you produce knowledge. And this is all good. This needs to be done, especially in an era where like disinformation is rampant. But on the other side, what they were doing during the Vietnam War, during the anti-nuclear movement, was organization, blockade, be there, be on the field, be where people who are protesting need protection. Because yes, there's repression. I've talked to people who were like long-time militants for whatever cause they were there. And now, well, maybe because they aged, but they say, now I'm scared. When you see people who've gone through like the Vietnam War protest and now they say, I'm scared now and I'm scared for my kids, it tells you the level of repression. But also, the more we organize, the more you document police violence, the more you go on the field and you talk to people. I think this type of organization of like taking back the streets has been, I wouldn't say replaced, because now we've seen the climate march, we've seen the campus occupations. I wouldn't say it's not there anymore, but to balance the advocacy and the on-the-field organized protest and organized action, and to their being disruptive sometimes, it could be the key.
Well, on that note, I thank you very much for this conversation and for coming onto the podcast. I think we've covered so much ground, from the context to what's happened to pacifism to what Greens can do, and then also looking ahead with the current situation in the US and the role that civil society can play. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And thank you all for tuning into this episode. Don't forget to check out the other episodes in this series and to follow the Green European Foundation on social media. See you very soon. Oh, by the way, do you know where all the hippies have gone? This podcast is produced by the Green European Foundation with the financial support of the European Parliament. The views expressed are solely those of the contributors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the European Parliament or the Green European Foundation.